Well, thanks very much for turning out this evening. I think it's going to be worth your while. We've got a really well-informed panel, and as you know, the subject is Darfur, as ever in the news, like Sudan. A big debate over the international campaign on Darfur, the good it's done and the bad it's done in some people's views. So we're going to have all those issues raised tonight among our three experts, and we hope very much that you will join in. So initially we're going to talk among ourselves and go through some of the core issues, and after about half an hour then we'll throw it open to the floor. But if someone says something you violently disagree with or don't understand, by all means raise your hands, and I think we can make it a fairly sort of fluid discussion that way. If I can introduce the panel to you, on my right is Dr. Ahmed Shahi, who runs the Sudan program with Bono Marwal, a distinguished Sudanese academic and policy advisor and politician. And he has had a long engagement, almost a lifelong engagement with the politics of the Sudan. He's recently come back from Khartoum, so he will have the up-to-date information about what's going on politically there, I hope. On my left is Ambassador John Holmes, who was the Under-Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs at the UN at the critical time from 2007 to 2010, when there was an escalation of interest and engagement in the crisis in Darfur, and indeed more generally in the Sudan. He is now the director of the Ditchley Foundation. Prior to joining the UN, he was a senior diplomat in the British Foreign Service. And on my extreme left, no ideological alignment intended there, is Mukesh Kapila, who was the resident representative of the UN in Khartoum at the critical point in 2003, 2004, when the first clashes blew up in Darfur between the SLA and the government. And the crisis first came, and I would say, I think for those of us who followed the politics of Sudan, somewhat belatedly, because this is not a crisis that started in 2003 or anything like it. It's been going on much longer than that. But Mukesh was there at that time and took a very strong line on behalf of the UN, and has accordingly very strong views on what the UN did and didn't do and should have done in Sudan. So as I said, the proposition tonight is the UN continuing to fail in Darfur, and there is a sort of inbuilt assumption there that it failed utterly in the past, and it's continuing along that track. So I think it's probably worthwhile starting with Ambassador Holmes, who will take us through the reasons for the UN engagement and the circumstances for the UN engagement and what it achieved and what it failed to achieve.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to try and give a history of Darfur or the early part of the UN engagement in Darfur, because I think Mukesh is much better qualified to do that, and our other colleague can say more about the overall politics of the situation. My experience came very much between 2007 and 2010, when I was the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator. I visited Darfur a lot, 5 times in 3 years during that period. And obviously my focus was on humanitarian issues, that's what I was being paid to do, but I also had an overview of the overall situation, and I'll try and give a reflection of both of those. By the time I got there, and I first visited in March 2007, there was actually relatively little open fighting going on, certainly compared to 2003, 2004, and maybe the year or two after that. But there were still regular attacks on villages by the Janjaweed. There was tribal fighting of different kinds. There was occasional rebel attacks on the Sudanese forces in a very unstable security situation. And what we were faced with on the humanitarian side was 2 million people who were displaced from their homes, about 1.2 million of those who were in large camps scattered around Darfur, 4 million people out of an overall population of about 6 million, in other words, 2/3 of the whole population more or less dependent on humanitarian aid, And that was the biggest humanitarian aid operation in the world at the time, and still is, about $1 billion a year. So really a big operation there. Looking at the broader situation, at that particular time in 2007, which is a year after the peace agreement, supposed peace agreement which had never been implemented, the overall security situation, the overall political situation was stuck. It wasn't really moving. It was stagnant. There was no real progress. And frankly, it stayed that way throughout my time. I think it's pretty much the same now. Nothing very much has really changed. Now, as you say, the title of the event is a bit prejudicial. When did you stop beating your wife? What I would say is that the UN in Darfur, in my experience of it, certainly in those years when I was there, had been given an impossible task. This was a classic situation, if you like, of sending in UN peacekeepers with no real peace to keep when you couldn't really think of anything else to do. And it actually was worse than that in this particular case, because UNAMID, the peacekeeping force in Darfur, which is a hybrid force between the UN and the African Union, followed on from AMIS, which was an African Union force, which had essentially failed for all sorts of reasons, which I won't go into now. But in this particular case, unlike most cases where the government is a reasonably willing participant or gives its consent to the deployment of a force, in this case the Sudanese government only agreed to this extremely unwillingly and because they felt they had no choice. And they insisted on continuing African Union involvement in that force. And basically the Sudanese government at the time, and still now, continues to do everything it can to complicate the task of the force and essentially to make it fail. The problem is that the UN had only partial control of the force because of its hybrid nature with the African Union. The African Union had no capacity really to direct or control the force, but was extremely sensitive about its role in there for obvious reasons. And I would say, at times anyway, showed more sympathy for the sensitivities of the Sudanese government than we thought was appropriate in New York. So this is very much a complicating factor. They tried to insist on only African contingents being part of the force for a long time and mostly succeeded. The reasons they were doing that were not particularly noble, if we'd have to tell the truth. They slowed down the deployment of the force as much as they could. They obstructed it as much as they could. They obstructed its reinforcement as much as they could. And essentially they made it very difficult for the force to operate. At the same time, the rebels, who might have been thought to be sympathetic to UNAMID, to the intervention of the UN, quickly became suspicious of the force because they thought it was, because of the African Union involvement, they thought the African Union was too close to the Sudanese government. So they didn't really cooperate or think the presence of UNAMID was helpful either. And a final factor is that the international community never really put its money where its mouth was, where the force was concerned, because they were never forthcoming with, for example, attack helicopters and transport helicopters, which the force desperately needed, which restricted its mobility. Now, those are the handicaps which the UN force was facing. Even given those handicaps, I think we have to say that UNAMID has performed, and still performing, very poorly. It didn't manage to impose itself in a military sense at all. It didn't manage to generate respect for itself. It was regularly humiliated in different ways, militarily and politically, by the government and by the rebels. It had, frankly, poor leadership and discipline. It had suspicions constantly that its heart wasn't really in its task. The humanitarian community was very suspicious of it because they thought that it wasn't doing its basic job of providing security for the IDP camps, the camps for the internally displaced people, but was trying to interfere in inappropriate ways in the aid operation, and was again pursuing an agenda which was too close to the government. So UNAMID is not a successful operation, and I think it continues very much in that way. The other main UN African Union role while I was there was to try to help broker a new peace agreement. As I say, the 2006 agreement, although the substance of it wasn't actually, I think, bad, but was never implemented for all sorts of reasons that we could go into. It never had enough buy-in by either side to really be implemented. So there was a need to negotiate something new, and this was attempted first of all by Jan Eliasson from the UN and Salim Salim from the African Union. Again, Salim Salim was regarded with huge suspicion because he came from the African Union, not fairly at all, but that was the reality of it by the rebels. And then more recently by the former Foreign Secretary of Burkina Faso, Djibril Bassoli. These efforts essentially were undertaken in good faith, but have completely failed for all sorts of reasons. The government was never really interested in those peace negotiations and never really interested in an agreement. And the rebels were too divided, had no unified negotiating team, no unified platform, were far too chaotic to negotiate with, and therefore that made the whole process impossible. Just very quickly on some of the challenges on the humanitarian side, there's not only the size of the operation and a very difficult terrain to operate in, but also the essentially hostile attitude of the Sudanese government to the humanitarian operation, despite the fact that we were actually keeping a lot of their own population alive and saving them a lot of money, because otherwise they would have had to do it themselves. They disliked the presence of the humanitarians because the humanitarians were witnesses to what was going on. They disliked the humanitarians because their insistence not only on providing physical aid to people, food, water, whatever it might be, but also engaging in wider protection of civilians' activities, for example, investigating human rights abuses, sexual violence, whatever, which the government flatly denied the existence of, contrary to all the actual evidence. So there's constant problems with the government about visas for humanitarian workers, about harassment of humanitarian workers, making their job impossible, refusal of permission to travel, that kind of thing around the country. And the challenge that I faced constantly at this time was to maintain a balance between denouncing the unacceptable actions of the government, and indeed of the rebels, who were no heroes in this either, while at the same time trying to maintain a working relationship with them to allow the humanitarian operation to continue. And that was difficult enough, but it became much more difficult in late 2008 and early 2009 as the prospect of the President Bashir, being indicted by the International Criminal Court became a reality. And in March 2009, when he was finally indicted by the International Criminal Court, the government responded by expelling 13 NGOs who were working on the humanitarian side, and basically cutting the capacity we had on the humanitarian side pretty much in half for their own reasons. They had trumped up grounds of spying and aid diversion. They believed, I think, that the humanitarian organizations were providing the evidence for the International Criminal Court accusations against not only Bashir but the others who were indicted at the same time. So the question then was, do we try to fill in the gaps? Do we kind of accept that and stay and try to stay in touch with the government, or do we withdraw in protest against this completely unacceptable behavior? And we decided in the end to protest, to call for the reverse of the decision, but to stay. I think that was the right decision, because otherwise we were punishing the people of Darfur, not the government, but it's an arguable point whether we should have just left on a matter of principle at the time. I think the ICC was also became a bit of a problem for us in other ways, because the UN had two peacekeeping forces in Sudan at the time, not only UNAMID in Darfur but also UNMISS in southern Sudan. And this is quite difficult to maintain when the head of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, was not really supposed to have any dealings with the head of the state where you had these two peacekeeping forces. So this was not an ideal situation. Moreover, it's very difficult to negotiate peace or try to negotiate peace with a government whose head has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. So this became quite a problem and quite an illustration of the dilemma of the battle there sometimes is between justice and peace. People say they go hand in hand naturally. Actually, they don't always. So however much Bashir and others may have deserved that indictment by the ICC, it became a complicating factor in the search for peace, and indeed remains so today. Just a couple of final comments. First of all, the fact that people, there's a large population of Darfur are still in camps, 1.2 million people probably still in the camps 9 years later, is actually profoundly worrying from every point of view. The point is, how many of these people, even if there is a peace settlement, will ever go back? Probably not, probably 50% at most. Some of the camps have become suburbs of the main towns in Darfur. People are attracted by the bright lights of El Fasher, which may, if you've ever been to El Fasher, is a funny thing to say, but compared to some villages in the middle of Darfur, they are bright lights. So how many of those people, especially the young people, will ever go back to village life must be an open question. So how much damage has been done to the fabric of Darfur society by the existence of these camps? Now, that's not the humanitarian community's fault exactly, and I think we've been right to resist over time government pressure to close the camps, to send people back home on the pretense that everything's been settled and it's now peaceful, when manifestly it's not. But in the end, as often happens, the humanitarian effort becomes as much part of the problem as part of the solution because we've been there so long and the population have become permanent camp dwellers and aid dependent, and that's a real problem. There's no easy way out, but it's an illustration of the fact that humanitarian operations are never a solution to a problem. Unless you can fix the political situation, the humanitarian issue is a diversion in a sense. Final point, the UN is often blamed for failure in Darfur, and I say the title of this event very much illustrates that, and no doubt that the UN has made many mistakes, and I think Mukesh will no doubt talk about some of them. But I would say just don't always shoot the messenger. The UN is in a sense a messenger for the international community here. Darfur is everyone's failure. And it is a failure. It's most of all a failure of the Sudanese government. It's also a failure of the rebels who have failed to achieve any of their objectives and have been chaotic in the process. The Sudanese government can block progress in Darfur, but can't create anything. It's all tactics and no strategy, as far as I'm concerned. But we also need to look at the wider role of the international community. The Security Council has been divided about Darfur, as on many other things, for a long time. So it means that the measures they've taken have been pretty much half-hearted, and unfulfillable instructions have been given to the peacekeeping force in Darfur as elsewhere. And from a Western policy point of view, I think there's been a fatal hesitation between denouncing the government in Khartoum and regarding them as beyond the pale and therefore not being willing to work with them, and at the same time trying to engage them. And the result of that has been falling between two stools, a failure to engage them, but a failure to change them at the same time, a policy of empty threats, if you like, because they were never going to overthrow the government in Khartoum. They never had the leverage to make the government in Khartoum what they wanted to do, especially given Russian and Chinese opposition to that. So this was effectively a failed policy, and I think we should, if we're allocating blame, we should allocate blame very broadly here and not just to the UN. Unfortunately, although you say Darfur is in the news, Darfur is not in the news. The international media have lost interest in Darfur for all sorts of reasons. The spotlight has moved on elsewhere, and so it's not really being focused on anymore. I would also say, frankly, that the peace efforts were not really helped by some of the rather simplistic campaigns that were being mounted in the West. The Save Darfur campaign, with its accusations of genocide and the focus on purely the African-Arab issues when the issues are much more complicated than that, I'm not sure really helped. Because in the end, Darfur is only a symptom of the bigger problem in Sudan, and the bigger problem in Sudan is how the country has been run from the centre with no thought for the interests of the periphery and no resources for the periphery. And that's why you've seen a revolt not only in Darfur, but also in the south, in the east, in the past. And those problems have not been solved. So, roll on Arab Spring in Khartoum will be my final comment.
Right. Well, that's a provocative start. Mukesh, I'm relying on you for some provocative statements on the role of the UN, because your view is that it has signally failed, and you can give us some pretty concrete instances on how it failed and why it failed.
You can certainly rely on me to be provocative, and let me start by contradicting you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I think one of your statements, I trust it was only a throwaway remark to kind of warm up the thing, was that Darfur it's a long-standing conflict.
It is.
And the conflicts have been going on for a long time in Darfur.
Yes.
True. But what started in 2003 is not just the latest chapter in a long decades of tension, and many theories have been given about that, pastoralist versus agriculturalist, because never before in the history of Darfur have Antonovs been used. Never before have in the traditional skirmishing between the communities in a vulnerable, environmentally challenged environment, has there been tactics which called for mass rape by men in uniform. Never before have water wells, which are destroying water sources is tantamount to basically a death sentence. Never before has it been done. So I think to characterize the events that took place in 2003-04 as just the latest chapter in a long-running conflict is doing a disservice. What happened in 2003 was the beginning of an orchestrated campaign using the technologies available at that particular time and the organization, command and control available at that time. It was a genocidal campaign. This is for the courts to determine, but in fact some of the charges and the UN's own inquiry come to that point. And this is really important. What happened in 2003 and 4 is not just an extension of history. It is a new step change. It's a conflict de novo, if you like, against a background, if you like, of bad governance, periphery, and all the points that you made, John, and et cetera, et cetera.
Would you agree that one of the flashpoints was the fact that the government in Khartoum faced, for the first time, a very organized opposition, an opposition that could incapacitate their air force, for example?
I mean, sure, of course. In fact,
but what I wanted to get across was that one needs a historical perspective.
Well, but then
there is a conflict.
Yeah, no.
There are issues that go way back.
I think it's very important to put into perspective. If there was an organized opposition, we have to ask ourselves, why do the citizens of Darfur, after suffering the indignities for decades, suddenly organize themselves? It is not as if Khartoum was responding to the opposition. We have to ask ourselves, how did the opposition come into being, if you want to get down to the root causes? However, that is not what we're discussing. We're discussing the UN. Now, I'm going to talk about 2003, 2004, where as a very young humanitarian and resident coordinator, I think at that moment in time, the youngest humanitarian resident coordinator appointed in history by the UN to head what at that time even was the biggest UN operation because of Operation Lifeline Sudan in the south, before Iraq came along, arrived with very little UN experience on secondment from the British government. But my journey to Darfur did not start in 2003. It started off in exactly 10 years before in Rwanda, where as a ODA official, ODA DFID now, part of the Foreign Office, sent me to actually witness what was going on in Rwanda, and shortly around that time also in Srebrenica. And there I saw for myself, what happens when an international response system basically implodes because of his contradictions, for all the reasons that John has very fairly pointed out, that if there is a failure, it's the collective failure rather than it's a failure of any particular entity. So at that time, and then there was the inquiry which Kofi Annan conducted on Rwanda and Srebrenica. This is all extremely relevant to understand why we failed in Darfur. And Kofi Annan, who was head of peacekeeping, I believe, in Rwanda and Srebrenica, etc., and then he issued his mea culpa, saying we goofed up and we should have done more, etc., etc. And then he was a Secretary General and my principal boss when I was a UN chief in Sudan. And all the lessons of the inquiry of Srebrenica and Rwanda, which were official inquiries of the UN system, published big reports, launched, etc., all of them were forgotten in terms of the UN response to the origins of the Darfur crisis. So going to the earliest days in 2003, 2004, evidence coming out, early warning systems coming out about the nature of the violence being started. And from the UN, we had deafening silence. There were memos upon memos upon memos. And in my time, there were emails. In General Delay's time, there were cables. But if you look at General Delay's cable back to Kofi Annan in 1994, and you look at my email to Kofi Annan in the 2004, you could put them side by side, and they were almost identical in words. One was a cable, one was an email. That's only different. So the point is there's an amnesia, if you like, within the UN system at the very top. The Security Council, for example, was not seized by the matter. It was seized up about the matter. Africa's longest running conflict, which had generated Africa's greatest population displacement internally because of the South and all the rest of it, in Africa's biggest country at that particular time, had not been discussed in the Security Council at all forever since memory serves us. Now, if that isn't the failure of the political leadership of the UN, what is? Even when the refugees started flowing into Chad, and this became, therefore, a threat to international peace and security, and there were Eritrean and Libyan and many other allegations, founded or not founded, we can argue about that, deafening silence. So that is the failure. So if there were subsequent failures, as John very fairly pointed out, then I think we have to root back and see where the original failure was. Secondly, the UN, I think, completely at that particular time subcontracted its principal responsibility for it to a self-elected club of member states, the UK, the US, and Norway. Good states, and nothing to say against them, generally speaking. But the point was, how can the premier world body, subcontract the most significant process, political process? And the reason was the Department of Political Affairs, headed by Karen Prendergast at that particular time, wasn't interested in this. It didn't want to invest in fragile political capital on the political side. So the messages I would get back when I was sending my messages asking for instructions, New York, what do I do? New York, what do I do? The message I would get back was not from political affairs. It would be from Jan Egeland, a good man, head of humanitarian affairs, giving me advice on how I should get more humanitarian aid into Darfur. The issue then being that a political crisis being reduced to a humanitarian solution. And that was fundamental root of the failure that then went from it. And then, of course, you see, I remember hanging around Naivasha peace talks. I was representing the UN in those peace talks. And like in these peace talks, most of the time you spend doing nothing because there's days and weeks of boredom where absolutely nothing seems to move. These things, you know this, John, these things take place in the corridors. And so what you do, you spend your time at the bar, basically, getting drunk. So, and the conversation in the bar in Naivasha was which member state, which functionary was going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing about the peace agreement. So egos of countries were at stake. And then this became an issue for member states in terms of their positioning in the forums that we are talking about. And this is the inside story of really of what was going on. And then I saw Garang, the leader of the SPLM in the south, and I said to him, when are you going to sign the peace agreement? And he said, I'm not going to sign the North-South peace agreement until Darfur is sorted out, because when I become the vice president of United Sudan, and I know perfectly well the military and intelligence would remain in control in Khartoum, people are going to blame me for the ongoing conflict in Darfur, and all the moral capital I have earned through my leadership in the south will be eroded because I wouldn't have the power. So I duly reported that to Kofi Annan and say, you're not going to have any peace agreement being signed between the north and south for some time, okay? I go up to Khartoum, meet my friends. At that time I had plenty of friends in Khartoum, and they said to me in the president's office, in al-Bashir's office, they said to me, we will sign the peace agreement, but we will do it once we have sorted out Darfur. And the words used were the final solution. And you know when that word was last used in this continent, that word final solution. And I duly reported that to that. Now this was the huge complexity. So if there is a failure, that's the political failure that goes back. Let me stop there because there's lots to talk about. But one of the things I hope we'll talk about is, I agree that Darfur is everyone's failure, but that is an alibi to say that it is no one's responsibility, and that cannot be so. That cannot be so, because unless we actually, find and put individual accountability on people who made decisions within the UN and within governments who paralyzed the UN or who did not act, there is no solution. So to say it's a collective failure, John, I agree. But unfortunately, this is also an alibi that allows us to get away with it, and that's a failure. Secondly, and finally, I think complexity. It's a complex matter. And say Darfur and others are complex, are kind of simplify things. But let me tell you one thing. Very often, when you don't want to act on anything, or when it's too difficult to act, or when it's inconvenient to act, and that was my experience. I went to most, in my diplomacy, when I was known as the United Nations coordinator outside the Sudan, because actually I spent more time traveling to New York, Oslo, blah, blah, London, etc., to try and engage with the great powers in those particular areas. See. And when people don't want to hear, when it's inconvenient truth, if you can call it that way, you see, what you say is everything is connected to everything else. Everything had its origins in the last millennium, and it goes back to traditional conflicts. And of course, you see, this is not quite this is not quite that. And then what happens? The complexity then becomes, or the perceived complexity becomes an alibi for inaction. You see. Now, actually, the narrative can be simplified when it comes to accountability for the crimes against humanity, which were well established. And without that accountability for the crimes against humanity, there will be continued failure in Sudan. And not only that, as I saw for myself last week, 2 weeks ago in the Nuba Mountains, where I went just before Clooney, and I'm glad he agreed a week later. The point was, the infection of Darfur has already spread to the Nuba Mountains, and the perpetrators of that are these people indicted the criminal, the governor of South Kordofan, who's doing the same thing in Nuba. Therefore, the point about failure is not that it was just a historical failure, but impact of that failure continues to be paid, the cost of that failure continues to be paid in suffering, oppression, and blood by not just the Darfuris, which continues, but now also in other parts, of the Sudan. So yes, it's been a total failure.
Right, that's clear enough.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mukesh. Ahmed, can
Yes.
I ask you for your opinion? Is it a total failure in your opinion? And,
Yes.
and how do you apportion the blame between the AU or the UN? Or do you think it's a success? Do you think it's actually done some good?
I'm not really denying the fact that the UN is doing something good in terms of help to the Darfurians, displaced people. But I think I do agree with total failure. And I think if I may just take John's point, I'm afraid failure even on our government's part, the British government. And I was asked that Abdul Wahid al-Noor and Khalil Ibrahim could come to Oxford to negotiate and to talk about their problems. So I contacted the powers to be here in London, and I was told those two gentlemen are not desirable to come to this country. They should go to Doha. And I said, well, they don't go to Doha, they don't go to Khartoum, they don't come to London. What is wrong? You want to talk to those people. They are the most important parts of Darfurian problem. So Darfur is not only British government, the Arab League, the African Union, the Islamic Conference, the Arab League, and the AU. They're all part. Darfur is becoming kind of public relation exercise. The razzmatazz of American actor and actresses. What has been done about ordinary Darfurians? Just tell me. I'll be very... More refugees, more problems, more bombing, more conflict. It's ridiculous to talk about Darfurian as if, oh yes, it's a very easy problem. You said there's what has been done about it for the last 2003? I go back, for example, beyond 2003. Darfurian problem is not an exception. The South was in conflict, the East, Darfur, because these are marginalized provinces or regions. For a long time, successive military and civilian government never addressed the lack of services, the lack of participation in the center, and Darfur is one of them. Okay, let me just tell you an incident which is really very interesting to illustrate how Darfurian portray their problem. Not the United Nations, not Sudan government. I was sitting in the foyer of a hotel, and there is a delegation of 10 Darfurian and men and 2 women sitting waiting for a car to take them to see President al-Bashir. And opposite us was a Saudi Arabian businessman. I was in conversation with the leader of the Darfurian. Remain nameless. He's quite a powerful man. We were talking about Darfur, and the Saudi turned to this Darfur and he said, what's your problem? And he said, you don't understand the Sudan or problem? Darfur has been for long. No, I don't understand. Tell me. He said, simply I'll tell you that our local problem became a province problem, it becomes a regional problem, it became a state problems, and international problem, because the state became part and parcel of the conflict in Darfur. And the Saudi never really understood the complexity. You talk about complexity. So here we are. He was absolutely right that from a local issues, the conflict between agriculturists and nomads, suddenly the Janjaweed appeared on the scene. The first time, suddenly the Sudan government became involved, and the opposition. It's not a question just only Sudan government bombing, but also the opposition, organizing themselves with help from the outside. So that is, how Darfurians saying, leave us alone. We could solve our problems. But here we are. Can the United Nations pull out? Can Sudan government pull out in order to let the Darfurians solve their problem? The second, and that is very important, 3 days ago, I received something from the newspaper. The governor of Darfur, Eastern Darfur province, his name is Hamad, Ismail Hamad. This is what he has to say about the problem of Darfur. He said the province received a monthly allowance of only 16 million Sudanese pound. which is absolutely negligible. Whereas the Jazeera province received 48 million, despite the fact that the population of southern Darfur is higher than that of the Jazeera province. This is the imbalance, the inequalities. Jazeera is part of the Arab culture, Darfur is part of the Western culture. But this is a problem here, the imbalance of really divesting some of money to Darfur to be invested in building infrastructure. He said that the province is in debt to the tune of 6 million, and in newly appointed civil servants, salary arrears amount to 18 million, not being paid civil servants. And the province, and also both, the whole province is in debt to the tune of 300 million. And that is one province of Darfur. I have no idea what the others. He said both the government of southern Darfur province and the eastern province criticized the way, here is very interesting, the transfer of civil servants from other parts of the Sudan to Darfur. They're not Darfurian. And he said, can we accept those civil servants to come to serve in Darfur? Rather, we are not short of Darfurians to be employed in the civil service structure. He said also, I'm just really translating to see his exasperation with the central government. He said, therefore, his province cannot achieve the transfer of civil servants in order to avoid the problem this causes among civil servants and the population. In a sense, you are bringing outsiders to the province rather than people employed by the province. He said, the province of southern Darfur is quiet for the time being, but he expected an explosion at any moment as a result of the incursion by rebellions coming from southern Sudan, because southern Darfur province bordering southern Sudan, and via the province to other provinces of Darfur in order to carry out hostile attacks on our own very people. Now, this is real. I'm talking here about really the grassroots problems of Darfurian. I'm not talking about people sitting in air-conditioned offices, flying first class, and secretaries and computers. Those are the suffering of Darfurian. And people are not addressing this, frankly. I'm not saying they are not paying any lip service.
Who, in your view, is causing these sufferings?
Whether the central government of Sudan, whether the United Nations,
but you've studied it. Who is the principal author? I mean, you have a rebel movement.
I think both my colleagues have highlighted that it is a failure on many parts of the organization. It is not only just United Nations, in many parts.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the violence meted out to the people of Darfur, of the displacements, who would you hold responsible? Is it the government?
Well, it's very easy to say the government, but also the rebellion. I mean, the GEM, for example, and Sudan Liberation and the Darfurian, they themselves also fighting.
Do you think they're more or less equitable, or do you think the government mainly?
I think Southern Sudan, the central government has more, superiority of arms, of course.
So it's more responsible for the displacements and the killings. And do you think enough?
If you have conflict, sorry, Tony, if you have conflict, armed conflict in an area, it's both sides. If they're shooting, above the civilians, the civilians have to flee. So it is a problem of both sides rather than just the central government.
Do you think enough pressure was put on the government as the situation in Darfur escalated and more people were displaced? Do you think the African Union played an honourable role, a neutral role in trying to protect the civilian populations of Darfur? I
mean, hitherto, those African Union are really impetus. They haven't done very much trying to protect.
And do you think they were complicit with the government in that?
I have no idea. What I really like to see, and I think your question is pertinent to the problem, that unless there is inclusivity of international organization as well as Darfurian to sit round at a table to sort out this problem, I can't see. Piecemeal solution doesn't work. Armed conflict doesn't work, as indeed the southern Sudan proved to be the case. For long, two civil war, what did they have to achieve peace?
Well, they might say that armed conflict actually got them independence.
Now Darfurians are seeking help of southern Sudan in their conflict. Training
and they have got it historically.
Absolutely, yes. And also, but for example, I bring you another example of the international community, the way money has been raised to help Darfurian. One of my students, an American, remained nameless. He went to the State Department and fished out all the contribution made by two organizations, the Zionists and the extreme right Christian fundamentalists in America. And millions were donated to Darfur.
So do you think
I haven't finished, sorry, Tony. How Darfur is being portrayed? Darfur portrayed African Christians, all of them, like Southern Sudanese. So he exposed this fallacy. And of course, the Zionists went after him. He went underground. He rang me up, absolutely. Poor man, he was really in a fix. So he has to contract lawyers, his organization. And in the end, the case was dropped. This is the publicity, and I'm saying Razmataz's publicity about Darfur doesn't help solve the problem. One has to be truthful, one has to be honest, one has to be inclusive. The way I see it, like what happened in the South. I mean, even the South, there are shortcomings of the peace agreement. Not all the Southern Sudanese were incorporated into the peace process.
Sure.
And still those people are marginalized.
Yeah.
And that is wrong as far as I'm concerned. And equally, Abdul Wahid al-Nur, Khalil Ibrahim should not be marginalized. They should be part in the process of negotiation to achieve peace in Darfur.
But if going back to this issue of the African Union's role, if has been said here tonight that the African Union failed to put pressure on the government, the African Union sided with the government, and you're saying that the government was the principal author of the killings and displacements in Sudan, isn't that a major failing of policy on the part of the African Union?
Yeah, I mean, African Union is as impetus because they haven't got the resources, the
no,
the
but
logistic.
But there's a political issue as well. I mean, the African Union policy was pro-government.
But if you marginalize central government of Sudan, look, for example, the ICC, as has been mentioned. Bashir goes here and there even to countries where welcome. He's wanted by the ICC, right? And the African Union is just there. He went to some African countries, so it's there. He's not been handed to the ICC. So the African Union also, their hands are tied up for political reason. Now there is a change. What will happen, for example, is that Sudan lost oil. Now it's all in the south, and even the transportation of the oil now is very problematic. Both the Republic of South Sudan as well Republic of North Sudan, they are short of money. So there's going to be a problem economically unless they sort out their problem.
What impact, in your view, now you have the Sudan Revolutionary Front teaming up with GEM, the Darfur Liberation Movement? What impact is that going to have on the government, do you think? Do you think that represents a serious challenge to the government's policy in Kordofan and Darfur?
Inevitably, they will be supplied with weapons, supplied with logistics, supplied with publicity, no doubt, absolutely. But at the same time, do we want this to continue, the misery, making more people, the refugees, killing more people, destroying their livelihood? No. Why shouldn't I'm asking John here, why shouldn't the United Nations ask for a conference, for an inclusive conference to bring all Darfurians as well as the Sudan government to this issue, around the table to say, Ban Ki-moon, why didn't he say, let us have a conference on Darfur by all the interested people?
Well, there was an attempt to do that in 2008, I think, with Jan Eliasson and Salim. The issue was the government prepared to go along and negotiate in good faith, but also, at that particular moment, I think there were 18 rebel factions in Darfur because they'd all split in all sorts of different directions, partly encouraged by the Sudanese government who were bribing people and deliberately driving wedges between them in order to make sure there wasn't a united rebel front. So actually a conference was impossible to convene. It would have been no point.
I don't think, John, of that, if you bring the two major ones, GEM and SLA, they will.
Well, at that point,
because those people,
at that point, the SLA and particularly Abdul Wahid sitting in Paris was not willing to go to a conference.
Yeah.
So
he was, John, but I'm
my experience, he was never willing to leave Paris.
He wanted to come. He said, Ahmed, I will come. He was ringing me up from Paris. He said, I'm willing to come, but can you get me visa to come to England? And of course, he, saying this is an impossibility. Why? Because the power to be saying, no, they should go to Qatar. And what did Qatar say? Is a piecemeal solution for one faction of Darfurian who didn't, and that faction does not have really political roots into Darfur. It's not. Like Minni Minnawi, they conducted peace with PID, and he just opted out of the whole thing. In a sense, if you make piecemeal solution, you, as I say in Arabic, يحتويهم means to incorporate them and then keep control over them rather than leaving them free to, to decide policies in Darfur.
Going back to why do you think all international attempts to put pressure on the government to change have failed? What's your view?
I think international governments have their own interests in Sudan too.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
look
why
at China. China has oil. Will China allow any resolution in the United Nations counter to which will harm the central government of Sudan or Sudan Republic? No, they won't.
But
because
Patrick,
two things: oil and secondly trade. And now they are really in a fix. They're trying to negotiate with the South. They're trying how to get the negotiations started.
So now you think
Yes.
the government of Khartoum, because it's lost 2/3 of its oil,
Yes.
Is in a much weaker position? Is it going to be more willing to negotiate if pressure is put on it?
Well, Sudan government has its own policy by going around to Arab nations and Islamic nations to appeal for help and investment, and there's a lot of people coming from the Gulf, particularly.
There's a story in the Arab press that the King of Saudi Arabia told Bashir to resign. I don't know if anyone's picked that up. Well, do you think it's plausible?
I don't think so.
You don't think he wants him to resign?
Bashir said he will not stand again for election many times.
In contrast, the U.S. Special Envoy is reported to have said that they don't want regime change in Khartoum.
Yeah.
And sending kind of mixed signals. But I think if I may intervene on this conversation a little bit by simply saying that, Patrick, your question assumes that we can fight 21st century extreme violent conflicts with 19th century, barely 20th century diplomatic tools and so on. It's not surprising the UN is ineffective. It's not surprising the African Union is ineffective. Why should it be effective when these organizations, with their particular construction as interstate entities, and Sudan is a member of these organizations and is entitled to membership services, from that organization. How can it be effective, if you like to see? And the idea that actually, there are that there are reasonable-minded people on which you can exercise reasonable arguments and apply reasonable pressure, and they will come to their reason, and then say, okay, sorry, yes, we should do this. Now, that is a very flawed assumption. The nature of certain regimes, and what do we see in countries? And this is where I think there's a fundamental contradiction. We are assuming that the violence that poor Sudan has enjoyed in the last decade in particular is somehow a kind of a slightly extreme version of normal bad governance and bad situations around the world. It isn't. The regime in Khartoum is a master at its particular application of extreme violence. And what happened in Darfur was actually, and I knew this because at that time I was heading the British aid operation into southern Sudan when I was still in London. And we saw the tactics they were using from Khartoum in relation to South Sudan. So those polished tactics were further polished into Darfur. Now, are we saying that we're going to sit down with these people and that say, look here, Bashir, this is very bad things you're doing, come to your senses, when reason? Well, of course not.
So are you saying no option other than force?
Well, I think
military confrontation.
Which was never a realistic option.
No, here is what I'm saying, so that I'll be very clear on what I'm saying. I am saying that it's very important not to bring false hope to the people of Sudan when the international community has got little to offer. So the idea, I mean, the chimera, if you like, is, and we saw this in Iraq in earlier incarnations of, when Saddam was first assaulted. The idea that somehow the international community's resolutions, whether it's Security Council or potential peacekeepers or diplomatic sanctions, is somehow going to bring about change of behavior. And therefore the people of Sudan hold fire. We are marching, and change will happen. That chimera should be overcome. In other words, if we don't have the answers, we should not stand in the way of those local people who will find answers in their own particular way. Remember under international law, self-defense is allowed. So if the regime in Khartoum is cannibalizing its own people,
So,
then I think if those people wish to organize themselves to try and do away with the regime in Khartoum, we do not have the moral right to stand in the way.
You regard GEM and the SLA as legitimate organizations of self-defense for the Darfuri people?
I'm saying that the movements that have sprung up, opposition to Khartoum, after all the history we have talked about, elements of which we have talked about, is quite understandable that at the periphery of Sudan, long insulted people, abused people, are beginning to organize themselves.
And do you think they should be armed externally, or the West and the UN should just not get
well,
in the
obviously,
way?
I think, I mean, I am no longer in the know to know if they're being formally armed or not externally, but clearly they're receiving support of some sort, you see. And what I'm saying is that this is not condoning violence or supporting them or encouraging them. I'm not a GEM activist or supporter. I have no particular, I don't know anyone there. But what I'm simply saying is, morally and ethically, when we as the international community have failed the people of Darfur and now the Nuba in the hour of greatest need, we are the last people to moralize on this particular subject. So if they want to get rid of Khartoum by violence, and they can do it through whatever support they can garner, do it. But don't try and create obstacles when actually you've done nothing to help them at all.
Okay, so where's that going to leave the UN now? You've got a situation where it's pretty evident.
I think
can I just finish my question? The SPLA, which is now the government in Juba, is clearly helping SPLA North in what is appearing to be an increasingly successful military campaign against the northern regime. Firstly, in South Kordofan, and then it's now extending to Darfur, courtesy of GEM. What should be the international position on this? Avert your eyes, let it continue, jolly good show because it's going to weaken Khartoum? What should the UN do?
Well, I think we have to distinguish what is the UN. We have to talk about the Security Council,
the UN
member
system.
states.
Should it just remain studiously neutral while this goes on?
No, I think the leaders of the UN system have got to show personal leadership, if you like. You see, we have had in the last month or two, we've had anemic statements from the Security Council, and I think this month the British are in the chair, or last month the British were in the chair, and a slightly stronger statement I was pleased to see, but still pretty anemic, and reminded me so much of the statements being made in 2003, 2004. And those statements, which were so anemic, they actually brought comfort. They had the opposite effect, if you like, you see. Because palliative statements actually make the situation worse. It is better not to make those kind of statements which might be misinterpreted and bring
well, what they're saying is both sides are in the wrong in South Kordofan. That was the Security Council, with a little bit more emphasis on the fact that the Khartoum regime have Antonovs and they're bombing civilians. But it was this attempt to portray it as an even-handed conflict.
Well, that's wrong, isn't it? I mean,
for those of us who've seen it.
But of course we can argue about the politics, and everyone is entitled to their opinion on the particular politics. But look at the UN mission. In Syria, we have Kofi Annan appointed as a joint UN-AU mission. You can't turn on the television without Kofi Annan, who no doubt has got much on his conscience to solve after his failures in Srebrenica and Rwanda. And good luck to him. And I hope, before he kind of does something there, because everyone should be given the chance to right the errors they've committed. But where is this special envoy? There is no UN voice. There is no united UN action. There is no credible peace process going on, because, and meanwhile what happens? Meanwhile what happens, apart from the International Criminal Court business, there is no comprehensive sanctions, there is no kind of personal and all. There are so many tools at our disposal, and I say thank goodness the oil has been stopped.
Okay, can I Ahmed, please come in, because
the question is that Sudan is a construct started in the 19th century and culminated by the conquest of British Egyptian forces in 1899 by Kitchener. And Darfur was incorporated in 1916 into Sudan. It was an independent sultanate. Perhaps, and the sign is that there is a fragmentation. That kind of construct bringing all the is collapsing gradually. And whether it is due to the central government, due to the outside interference, and the failure of international organization, the sign is that southern, Kordofan, the Nuba Hills, as well as the Darfur, is in that direction. Now, can the central government of Sudan or Republic of Sudan can afford to hold all these areas, Darfur, southern Kordofan, as well as the Nuba Mountains, with all the international pressure, as well as help and weapons and money, whatever, can they hold them? Can they hold, together these parts in the foreseeable future?
What's your verdict? Can they survive? Can Khartoum survive?
Well,
the Bashir regime, is it just going to dig in?
I mean, if theoretically speaking, al-Bashir, the more he really antagonize these places, the worse it becomes for him to reach a solution.
And do you think within Khartoum there's palpable, we saw this incident last week, 100 people stormed a police station after the killing of an aristocrat, aristocratic young lady. This seems to be unprecedented under the National Islamic Front rule. Is opposition escalating within Khartoum?
There is competition within the ruling party of the National Congress Party, what they call the inner circle of definitely. Now, the question now Bashir is trying to have a rapprochement with Hassan al-Turabi back again, because Hassan al-Turabi controlled Jem.
Yes.
And he thinks by negotiating with Hassan al-Turabi, Jem will stop fighting. I doubt it.
I doubt it, yeah.
Hassan al-Turabi may lose his position totally.
So when Hassan al-Turabi calls for a regime change, we shouldn't really take him very seriously.
No. I mean, what does he want to change for?
Yeah, so he just wants to go back to...
He wants to be in power himself.
The status quo ante.
Yeah, yes.
Right. So, John, you want
No, I just wanted to make the point that if the international community is fundamentally divided, as it is over Sudan, as it is over Syria, it's no good expecting the UN to kind of somehow fix that.
Agreed.
It can't be fixed. If China and Russia are not prepared not only to condone military intervention in Sudan, but even sanctions against the regime in Sudan, as they have been consistently throughout and haven't changed their mind since, then there are no real levers available. Now, Mukesh, at that point, you can't simply say, well, let's just let them get on with it, because actually the rebel movements have no power. They don't have the military strength to overthrow the regime in Khartoum, or even to give them serious pause.
And even the current situation isn't really substantially different from the past. You don't think this sort of latest surge is going to amount to anything?
I fear not. As I say, I finished my own remarks by saying I think you do need change in Khartoum. Until you have change in Khartoum, the rest of it's all pretty.
But the change will only come from within.
It will come from within. It won't come from without. And there are possibilities, presumably, of an Arab Spring in Khartoum.
Intifada.
It's a very complicated political situation. It's a military regime. There's an old system of the elite in Khartoum, which is extremely unhappy with the military regime, which which is Turabi's part of that. But do they have any real power? I don't think they do, unless they're supported from some movement from the bottom, which we haven't seen yet, but is not impossible.
But also to have southern Darfurian fighters and from southern Kordofan into southern Sudan is a danger to southern Sudan government. If there is a problem of friction between the SPLA.
Jem was not a Darfur movement. Jem was a national movement.
Yes.
Khalil Ibrahim, who is now dead, I think, his objective was to be president of Sudan, not to lead an independent
I think his brother,
Darfur.
who now runs the movement, I think has the same views. Well, of course, they got up to the outskirts of Khartoum a few years ago.
Yes. And was very daring and very successful. Was it not for the last minute, by the intelligence to counteract? But never thought, Bashir and his intelligence, that something like this should happen. In a sense, the bravery as well as the logistic of those people are able to do so. And one doesn't know whether this also may happen nobody knows, really. It's very difficult to say, no, it's not going to happen. Maybe this strengthening the intelligence.
So do you share the perspective that really improvements in Darfur are impossible until there's political change in Khartoum, until the NCP is defeated in one way or other?
In fairness, the present regime began to do something about Darfur, but not Darfur. I mean, we're talking about Darfur now, it's a huge area, vast. Quite a lot of it is desert. It's not something easy to say, I build a road. It costs millions or billions to build an infrastructure. Why? Because the neglect has been since beginning of the 20th century of Darfur. Very little. I mean, roads, railway lines, airports, industries, hardly. And that is the problem, that this neglect, people saying, how long we are going to stay like this for? Let us take the matter in our hands and fight the central government for our rights.
But Khartoum the present National Congress Party regime in Khartoum would never allow the sort of devolution of power that the people of Darfur are asking for. Because what you're saying is tantamount to allowing the breakup of the country.
Yes. I mean,
and they're never going to countenance that. So their only resort to
but on one condition, that depends
violence
on the strength of the opposition. I mean, if the opposition is strong enough with help from the outside, no doubt their help is coming from the outside and resisting.
Who do you think is helping?
Well, now I'm not going to get involved into any kind. But sorry, Nick, that if the opposition is strong enough, or what kind, this will be a stalemate, between the central government and the Darfurians. And
I think one of the things that many Darfuris say, or at least one can talk to here and there, is that so much blood has been now spilled that some are forgetting the injustice that has taken place, and then some are negotiating some kind of deal. It's not going to stick. And here, I did want to come back to this issue of justice and peace, a dilemma that is faced in many, many situations, and was, in this case, I think John brought it out very well when he spoke about the kind of complicating factor of the International Criminal Court at that moment in time. But I'm just trying to look at history, that whether anyone can name any sustained settlement in the last 20, 30 years that has worked without having a strong element of justice and accountability in it. Whether it is what we used to deal with, John, when we were both part of the British government machine in our different functions, the 17 peace agreements in Sierra Leone, or the Latin American wars which went on and on and on and on and on and on, despite numerous agreements in Honduras and all those sorts of things. So to expect somehow, after all that's happened in the last 10 years, to say simply that there would be a negotiated settlement with a bunch of murderers, some of whom were indicted by a judicial process, and it's for the court to determine the guilt or not, is too much to ask for. It's too much to ask for.
So I'll give you one example. I mean, the comparison is not exact. Northern Ireland, actually, we did a deal with all sorts of murderers, and actually let all sorts of people who've been convicted in British courts out of jail as the price of peace. I think that was worth doing.
So what are you saying that you think the warrants against Bashir and his defence minister should be negotiated?
Well, it's impossible. You can't do it once the ICC is indicted.
Well, I mean, the AU, for example, wants them suspended. Do you think that it should be a matter for negotiation?
Well, the trouble is to say, once it's done, it's done. You can't undo it.
But you opposed the indictments in the first place and thought...
All I'm saying is that it does complicate it. And the easy mantra that peace and justice go hand in hand is just that, an easy mantra. It doesn't correspond to the reality on the ground. Now, these people deserve their indictments. And many other people who haven't been indicted deserve to be indicted, there as elsewhere. But is this helping the peace process? Is this helping the Darfurians? Absolutely not. Is it helping the credibility of the ICC that they have people indicted who are never going to go to court in The Hague? Absolutely not. So, you have to ask yourself what purposes is serving.
Yes. Could you wait for the microphone and could you identify yourself to say where you're from?
Miles.
Thank you.
I've been involved in Sudan because I actually collaborated with the presentation of a play called The Slave here in London. And so it got me very much involved in the Nuba Mountains, where this young lady who was a slave came from. But I have been a businessman, and I heard you, all of you who are great diplomats, talking about a subject.
Some greater than others.
I'm not a diplomat at all. Let's get this straight. I'm a journalist.
I'm an academic,
as a businessman, I asked myself, what is the solution?
Yes.
And I would make a little suggestion to you. In Syria, the Chinese have been, and the Russians have been the troublemakers in not getting a solution going. Why don't we ask the Chinese to go to Sudan, where they own probably half the oil, and where they're very interested in a solution, and where they want to get the North and the South together, because the South has the oil and the North has the pipelines and the refineries and the ports, why don't we ask them to get involved and actually see if they can come to a peaceful solution of the overall situation? Because the South depends on oil, and it must be a terrible situation from them economically now, having no oil. So I'm asking you, gentlemen, could we not perhaps find a diplomatic solution, at least short term?
Well, I think Mukesh has already expressed his skepticism. But
well, I mean, two points really.
Chinese would be
on
good.
On the substance of what a Darfur settlement could look like, I think, as I've already said, the DPA of 2006, which had all sorts of elements of constitutional settlement and compensation and so on, is probably not very far from where a settlement should be. You need to adjust some bits of it, but you know, there is a kind of solution there if people would agree to it and actually implement it. On the point of the Chinese, you know, people have been trying for a long time to get the Chinese involved because they do have influence in the north and they do have influence in the south. But they're extremely reluctant to play any kind of role of that kind because it's against their principles, so they say, about non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. No, but an interesting example is the oil pipeline from the south to the north, which the south has cut off in an act of economic suicide. The Chinese are losers on both those fronts because they were the ones who were operating the wells and they were the ones who were buying the oil. But they should have seen this problem coming. They did absolutely nothing about it and they've lost a fortune in the process.
But they have offered to pre-finance the pipeline from the southern oil fields to Lamu.
It's not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
And they're not actually, you know, they're not sophisticated enough actually to play the kind of role they could play in solving some of those problems. They will have to be drawn into these issues over time, but they're not ready for it yet.
Can I just
quickly, and then we have a gentleman there in the second row who wants to speak. Yeah.
If you want to reach a solution, as you suggested, then there must be no preconditions to any talk on all sides. That they abandon all these preconditions, sit around the table, say, these are the problems. You know, it's everybody's putting preconditions. I will not talk to you unless 1, 2, 3, 4. And then all the different factions, my colleagues have highlighted, everybody have conditions. So how we are going to reach consensus? And that is really major problems into the problem.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Bashir. I'm Sudanese activist from Darfur as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the forum. What I'm going to say first is that there is a talk by the ambassador when you ask him who is likely to be held responsible of the refugee, of the displacement of the people of Darfur, and he made something like here and there. The government as well as the rebels. But I think the government is supposed to be held most responsible because there is a difference of these two, because the government, his initial intention in like these people to be taken to refugee camps so as not to be a source to the rebels. So the initial intention of the government is to take these people from their areas to be taken to the refugee camps, whereas the rebels are trying to protect these people if possible. But this is one point. The other point is that there is also a talk about the irresponsibility of not irresponsibility, but lack of resources to the African Union. But the problem is that is not exactly that case. We from Sudan, we know that the these African people, there is a real problem of corrupt generals who are supposed to be commanders to these forces. They cooperate very sincerely with the government of Sudan, and actually they receive their orders sometimes from the government of Sudan itself. So these are the corrupt people. They implement what the NCP government wants. So the problem is not a lack of resources as far as the problem of corruption. This is the last point is the legitimacy of protection of the people. I mean the rebellions themselves. They try to protect the people. When you say that these people are taking arms and fighting the government, this is because the government itself they challenge them. if anybody wants to resolve this problem or to take the power, as they say, they have to hold arms. So this is a challenge that offered by the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, a gentleman right two doors down from you.
Yeah.
Please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Hussein. I am Sudanese also. I am from SLA.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe I am not impartial.
Maybe not.
To talk, but yes, I want to tell some facts about Sudan. But first of all, I am very grateful for those who presented this this forum, those who attended, because me is Darfurian and me who is concerning the issue, but I found that other people around the world are concerning Darfur. This is a very grateful, and I am very happy, and I appreciate this attitude. Okay, when we talk about Sudan, what do you think about the country that about 50 years, all the resources of the country, starting from the ammunition up to the airplanes, war against its own people? In the history of Sudan, there is no war happened external. All these resources are directed to its people. Such a regime, I think that how to deal with is, Mr. Kabila did not say, but just to confront us the same methods it's used, you must use. This is because this, we SLA, we believe that how matter the time, we will face this regime until we go to the point of the solution. But we thank that other forces in the world, other bodies, especially media, as happened here, non-governmental organization over the world, civil societies, some activists, they are working fully, and we thank them. But the problem that the government of the superpowers, or say international community, they deal double standard. Why? The first, they were enthusiastic about the Darfur issue, and even in America, all the candidates they talk about, we solve the problem of the Darfur issue. But when they come to their yes, so they reduced. We don't talk about United Nations as this body, but the United Nations is represented by countries. Where are these countries? Why they solve the problem in Libya as quick as possible like that?
Do you see that as the way to solve the problem in Darfur? Do you want a military intervention?
I agree.
You want support for your organization? You want to be the NTC of Sudan, do you?
Yeah, I agree, because
a no-fly zone, NATO bombing campaign, the works. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, no-fly zone, NATO.
Do you think there's any realistic prospect Cameron, Sarkozy, and Obama have any interest in doing that?
Yeah. We need international intervention, because even we take Southern Sudan as example. For 50 years, they are killing people in the Southern Sudan. When the international community is become decisive, the problem of the Southern Sudan is solved now. Why not in Darfur? It should be also the same in Darfur.
So, as far as you're concerned, Doha peace process, talks about a Ban Ki-moon convention.
No use.
So all these diplomatic initiatives, we should just dismiss them.
Yeah, with this government, I said that with for 50 years, killing its people. They never think about that.
Okay, can I broaden it out a bit? Gentlemen, sort of two rows back. Is it? Sorry, a lady. Please let let's hear who you are.
Sorry, my name is Pai Hui Cai. I'm a freelance reporter from China.
Yes.
And I just have a very quick question for Mr. Holmes and actually all the panelists. Just a quick question. I think tonight we have talked a lot about the role of the UN and the role of AU and also the role of China. And clearly China is to blame for all the problems. And then I would like to hear your view on the role of the key Western powers. In your opinion, well, shouldn't whoever funded or supported or supplied arms to the rebels also responsible for the crisis in Darfur?
Ambassador Holmes.
Well, no, I don't think China is responsible for all these problems. I think China could play a bigger role in solving some of them. I think that's the issue that we would try to induce China to play as part of China's greater responsibility in the world overall. It's got plenty of issues of its own to address, but it can't avoid being part of the solutions to problems elsewhere. And I think that's what we would say also in Syria. Now, what role have the Western powers played? Well, I mean, not a very helpful role, frankly, in Darfur. As I said, I think they fell and are still falling between two stools of either denouncing the government and refusing to have anything to do with them and working for regime change, or negotiating with them. They've done both simultaneously, and that simply doesn't work. And that's a real problem. Now, I mean, the Western powers have not actually supplied the rebels with arms to any significant extent. And one of the reasons that nothing has really happened is that actually, with all due respect to our SLA colleague here, the rebels in Darfur are very weak. They're very weak militarily. They've always been very weak militarily. They, with the exception of the big raid in Khartoum, which nearly succeeded but was in the end a total catastrophe for GEM because it failed, you know, the amount of military trouble they can cause the government is rather limited. And I think the same is true, you know, even now in South Kordofan and Blue Nile. So the government is relatively comfortable. And you know, the Western powers are not going to help that. You know, and the idea of a international intervention, I think, is simply not on the cards. You know, Libya was a special case for all sorts of reasons. You know, there's a huge lack of consistency there. I absolutely accept that. But you know, if you're a Syrian, if you're an inhabitant of Homs, you would be saying, why aren't they doing the same for me as they did for the citizens in Benghazi? But the fact is they're not, and they're probably not going to. Because of, you know, all sorts of other reasons. And the same is true about Sudan. No one wants to take on Sudan militarily, and no one's going to do it. You know, that's the sort of unfortunate reality. Just to respond to one other point, you know, do I blame the government and the rebels equally? No, I think the government has a much bigger responsibility for what happened. They were the ones who, you know, as Mukesh described very graphically, who mobilized the Janjaweed and allowed them or encouraged them or ordered them to do what they did, which is absolutely appalling. They have consistently mistreated their citizens and refused to take part in any realistic peace efforts. The rebels are not responsible in the same way, but all I'm saying is that they have not, from a humanitarian point of view, when I was dealing with them, were not particularly responsible either. Have been so hopelessly divided amongst themselves in all sorts of ways that they never presented a realistic prospect of negotiation or military action. So you know, no one comes out of this story well. That's my sort of
You
basic
mentioned
point.
just now that the Western policy in UN, Western policy at least, was divided between those criticising the government, calling for a regime change, and those trying to negotiate.
It's the same people.
Same people. But
That's
which side of the fence should they have fallen, in your view?
Well, you know, if they could have fallen on the side of saying, "Well, have nothing to do with this. We'll change the regime," if they'd been prepared to carry that through. But they
Which
were
would
not.
have
So they
entailed
were
what?
empty threats.
Which
well,
would
it
have
might have
entailed
entailed some
support.
kind of no-fly zone, which I
Right.
actually wouldn't have recommended because I think it wouldn't probably have worked. But they could have done that, but they didn't do that. They were making empty threats about, if you don't behave, we're going to get, you know, what exactly?
Yeah,
But there was nothing behind that threat.
So
but they didn't actually negotiate and engage with the government properly either, with a brief exception when Obama appointed a man called General Scott Gratian, who tried to negotiate with the regime rather naively, in fact, and also got nowhere.
But
so
so-
you know, it's just a policy which is not consistent.
The implications of a negotiating track, do you think that a negotiating track, if properly resourced with senior diplomats, would have some effect with the current regime.
It might have succeeded.
It might
I
have
don't say
succeeded.
that it would, but I mean, it couldn't have been worse than what we have now.
And what we got was,
well, it might have
you're saying it's the
succeeded.
worst of both worlds. We got
Yeah, absolutely.
inadequate, we had rhetoric and inadequate
We
diplomacy.
proved ourselves to be impotent. and
It
we
might
didn't
have
actually negotiate
succeeded
either.
before too much blood was spilled. It might have succeeded in 2003. The point is that once so much blood has been spilled, once the scorecard is weighted as it is, it gets very, very difficult to think of a kind of balanced agreement. So I'm not condoning, there's probably laws in this country, aren't there, we shouldn't condone violence. So I'm not making any comment on armed whatever, SLA or whatever. But the point is that, do you really believe that the Khartoum regime is sitting there with all it has done, all the evidence at its thing, with the criminal court and all the other stuff, and we're going to actually sign a deal with them, an agreement with them? I mean, give me one, other than in relation to the divorce of the South, and that was underpinned by whole international structure. The Khartoum government has never kept any agreement it has signed with anybody, and that is my experience in my time in the UN and my successors' times. It has never done it. Now, don't be so naive. How are you going to get an agreement with them now? That's a complete red herring. This is diverting us from the real task ahead. And tell me, John, why is my ambassador, I'm British, why is my country, the United Kingdom, having full ambassador level relationship with Khartoum? The Americans do not have an ambassador. We withdraw our ambassador from Tehran at the whiff of a kind of a screw on the nuclear machine or whatever, and yet we have a full panoply of ambassadors sitting there. Now, even if the UN was to send a signal, the EU was to send a signal and say, right, this regime headed by a man who's wanted by an international judicial process, we will maintain our relations with them. Obviously, you do that as an interstate level, but it doesn't have to be headed by an ambassador, if you like. What if we did that? What if we did that? What if we looked into some of the other aspects that are to do with the flow of resources? And on the oil thing, I completely disagree with the current orthodoxy, which is that oil closure was a bad thing. Listening to President Salva Kiir recently, it was the wisest thing that could have happened. And this is what he said in discussions. He said, no country in the world, and with the infrastructural and institutional capacities that South Sudan inherited after its long history of trying to rise up, if you like, with the bonanza it now has got, actually has made good use of the resources. In country after country in Africa, without a proper institutional structure, the oil and natural wealth like that has actually been a curse. So what he said is basically, 80% of the economy of South Sudan is outside cash anyway, if you like. This modern state and modern economy is a very new phenomenon. So actually, it's better to build institutional capacity in the South so that they can actually learn how to use their oil wealth properly rather than it being diverted elsewhere. And then if it means it impoverishes the North, at least it does the job that sanctions doesn't do, meaning it doesn't have oil to sell. So I think when we talk to people on the ground, what they are saying is that actually this is one of the best things that has happened, and it is better to keep this precious wealth in common trust for the people on the ground until the region as a whole, South as well as Khartoum, are wise enough to be able to use those resources for the common good. So,
okay, Mukesh,
I just want to reply to
say
the
something on
lady
Sudan and on China, and let's have some more questions
yes,
on the UN issue.
on China. China is
98% of their revenue.
China is interested economically in Africa. They're not interested in the politics of Africa. They don't want to interfere in the politics of Africa, be it Sudan, Angola, or anywhere else. For two reasons. One is they need the energy, and secondly, and I think that's very important, the way they export their goods to Africa. They are dominating the market. Who is coming now to compete with them? The Turks. Turkey is now suddenly appearing as an economic power in Africa south of the Sahara as well as in the Arab Muslim world, vying with the Chinese as far as good is concerned. Now, I got engaged in an argument with Lu Jin, who was the Sudan representative, or China representative to Sudan, about the issue of South-North relationship. And he said, oh, I have seen President al-Bashir 15 times. And in passing, he said, I saw President Salva Kiir, this is before independence, twice. So when he sort of brushed this aside, so I asked him a question, and I said, how come? The oil is in the south. surely should be the reverse, rather than, you know. And he said, oh, no, no, tomorrow I'm flying to go say Salva Kiir. You know, it's this sort of thing China is trying to play one against the other. It doesn't work, and this is the problem now they're facing. Here are the two states locked as far as the future of the oil concerned, and China cannot do anything about it at the moment.
Okay, question right at the back there, please, with the gentleman with the red tie.
Dr. El-Shahi, I bow to your profound knowledge of Sudan and the region, but I wonder if you could clarify a comment that you made that characterized the crisis in Darfur as being civilians fleeing when two sides in the conflict are shooting over their heads.
Yes.
Because I think we've observed that the IDP camps and the refugee camps are full of, for Masalit and Zagawa. Do these ethnic groups have a predisposition to flee when people are shooting over their heads, or is somebody selectively shooting over their heads, and if so, who?
But I think, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't expect me to say that they flee because they have disposition, as if genetically determined. If there is a warfare going on and killing and shooting, naturally people want to seek some, you know, some peaceful place to flee to. It's a natural thing. Sorry?
Why is it those ethnic groups?
Anybody, I mean, why should they? I mean, they are supposed to, they are there.
What I mean is,
Because they're targeted.
it's two sides of a conflict. You've suggested it's two sides of a conflict and people are fleeing. The point I'm trying to make is it's only one particular groups of people that are fleeing. Are they not being selectively targeted by somebody?
Well, they were targeted. Of course, they were targeted.
Yes,
because,
I mean, you know,
because,
what
because of
you know,
there was
all the
there was
bombing,
an element of Arab-African issues here.
Yes.
There's an element of agriculturalists versus nomads.
Versus nomads,
the two
yes.
groups that don't coincide exactly, which is why one should be a little bit careful about using them. But they were targeted.
Yes.
Their villages were razed to the ground, and therefore they fled.
Yes, I mean,
but
it's
the
just
problem about the
natural.
fighting in Darfur, as in the fighting in many other parts of the world, is that the number of soldiers killed is very limited. The number of civilians killed and displaced is very large. So
The point is civilians were being targeted. It wasn't just people shooting over their heads. Civilians were being targeted. Is it?
No, no, saying, I mean, symbolically, if they're shooting, you know, shooting above each other, what do you think the people on the ground will do? They just sit like lame ducks and doing nothing about their future or about their safety? Of course they have to flee and go somewhere else.
Lady at the back there.
Hello, my name's Bathsheba, and I'm a law student. I have an initial question, which is sort of the question of, do you actually care about what's going on? And the reason why I ask this question is because caring sort of identifies the issue, and when somebody really cares about a situation, usually the issue is solved quite quickly. And when I ask this ask you, do you really care? I want to know, is it about the people? Really, is it about the atrocities that are being committed? Or is it about the oil interest? And if it is about the people, will a regime change the situation? If Bashir was brought to The Hague, would the people just suddenly spring up and be removed from poverty? When we look at the Kosovo in 1999, I mean, 10 years later, there's still 40% unemployment, organized crime and corruption. People are very, very poor there. And I forget my final point, but that's basically the crux of the question.
Can I answer you very briefly from my point of view about my colleague? Regime change, look what happens to Iraq. You got rid of Saddam, what happens to this very day? Every day there are 60, 50 people are killed. And the sectarian divide has been intensified to the maximum. Now, is that the regime change?
So you would have preferred to keep Saddam then? Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. He's a horror. Sorry, he's a horror. But you say regime change, you have not put structures instead of Saddam well in advance.
Well, that brings
to
me
ensure safety of people and to have a balance of power.
That brings me to what I wanted to say. My final question was, will the desert really bloom? You mentioned geographically that there's quite a lot of desert. So even if the oil resources are properly distributed, will there be agriculture? Will there be people who can eat properly, and then have education, and then structure, and then you have an organized society?
John.
Let's be clear about this. Sudan does not have very much oil. unless they find a lot more. There's very limited quantities of it, and it's running out rather rapidly. So this is not about oil at all. It's about power, it's about resources not being given to the periphery in Darfur and the south and the east. That's what it's about, and it's about water and grazing rights and agriculture and all sorts of things. It's not about oil. Caring is not enough. Caring does not solve the problem. We can care as much as we like. It doesn't solve the problem. You have to find a solution, find a political solution, impose a military solution, do something. Caring will not solve it. So that's why, save Darfur and George Clooney. Great. That doesn't solve anything. It draws attention to the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Okay, gentlemen over there, and then the gentleman in the striped shirt afterwards.
Okay.
Please.
Al-Bashir is
Yes, he's going to come.
the dictatorship. He's created war in Darfur and Blue Nile and South Sudan and East as well, all over around the country. Al-Bashir, who is responsible for this one. If just Darfur, we can say we can share the same responsibility. But now the war in Blue Nile and in Nuba Mountain and South Sudan as well. So if somebody thinks that now Al-Bashir, he can make good relationship between South Sudan and North. This is, for me, I come from war. I see the body thing like this, like somebody who is, he want to be a good relationship between France and German and UK while the Hitler in power. I can see like that. If it's the dictatorship, he can make peace. This is I think impossible. Another question: why the international?
Could you make it a question rather than a statement, so we can?
Okay. Why the international community not invest in URF unity? If he likes the unity of marginalization people. Now Abdul Wahid, Minni Minawi, and SPLM from North, united in one form. Why international community?
Why doesn't the West back the new opposition movement in the North?
Like it done in Syria?
Yeah. Well, and maybe with Qatar and Saudi as well. Gentleman in the striped shirt.
Yeah, Damien Lewis, I'm a journalist. I just want to make a couple of quick points and then a question. This is not about oil, it's not about people's livelihoods. This is about dignity and justice. If you had your family raped, if your son was made to rape your mother, if 4 million of your people were forced off your land, you imagine that happening to your town or your family or village. It's about, from my experience of Darfuris and all across Sudan, this is about dignity and justice. And that's why the idea of cutting the oil off from the south is the right thing to do, because that is also about dignity and justice. It's about people taking that moment to try and capture their dignity and justice. And you can't do that with the regime in Khartoum that exists at the moment, because you will never get dignity and justice with that regime there. You made the point about the IRA in Khartoum. I don't think you can make that point because the IRA were not mass murderers. You don't have indicted war criminals in the IRA. They would say they're freedom fighters fighting a just war. I think it's a completely different level of injustice, and therefore you can't say that is a valid example. Just on the China point, Amnesty International has only just issued a report saying China is the largest supplier of arms to the Khartoum regime. So they have massive culpability. So whether they are right to even influence and culpability. And in terms of Darfur and Sudan being a new Libya, and could Cameron go in there and arm the rebels? Well, there have been comments made tonight that the rebels are too weak. The rebels in Libya were a total shower with no weaponry or training, no history of armed resistance, and yet we went in there and we armed them and they were successful. The rebels in Sudan, in Darfur, in the south, wherever you want to talk about, are far more capable of bringing an end to this conflict if we went and helped them. That is a fact. So we shouldn't use that as an argument to say we can't go in. But then, sorry, to my question, because I know I've taken up a long time. And this goes to the heart of the debate, I hope. Is the panel somehow saying tonight that the UN is so redundant in Darfur that and in Sudan generally, that it should declare its own redundancy openly, so it cannot be used as an excuse for international inaction. Is that the argument that's being developed?
Well, I think it might be Mukesh's argument. Mukesh, what is your argument?
I think the UN should honestly admit its failure and its paralysis for the reasons I think which have been debated. So, but it's like the kind of mother, parent-child relationship. You can't make yourself redundant in the sense that you are always there. But what it should not do is be a false prophet. Launch misleading initiatives, which distract, bring false hope, and then actually leave people worse off than they were before. I think we should be honest about this. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think the UN is bound to continue to be a failure. And that is right, because we're talking about a 21st century conflict in the world of Twitter and globalization with an instrument which is, I think, a relic of the Second World War. And in conflict after conflict after conflict, it is proving that it never succeeds without other things happening around it, whether it's UN and African Union or UN and a regional body or other efforts going in, or a UN and a sponsoring power going in. That's what I'm saying. And I think being honest and getting off the backs of people and allowing them to seek and get their own destiny would be the better thing to do.
But what does that mean in practical terms? Does the UN withdraw? Should they have got out after Bashir banned the humanitarian organizations? He effectively kicked out aid organizations, which I think is a crime against humanity in its own right, in legal status, I think. Should the UN have pulled out at that moment?
Well, I think I'm not talking here about peacekeeping, but I think the civilian part of the UN, its presence is so thin anyway, you see. So I'm not sure what pulling out actually means. So stretched across this vast region.
That's not true.
That's stretched across this vast region. Look at the fragmented missions. We've got UN mission now in the Nuba, not in the Nuba, in Abyei. We've got a mission in South Sudan. We've got a mission in, the normal UN mission in Khartoum, and we've got some kind of Darfur type mission going on, successor of. And all these fragmented missions are simply, each with their limited capabilities, actually playing straight into the hands of Khartoum on the divide and rule principle. And but yes, I think we're wasting our time and resources.
So they should pull out. What about the humanitarian agencies? What about the UNHCR?
I think the UNICEFs and UNHCRs and WHO, etc., they should continue to do the best that they can, following the principles.
They stay there and cooperate with the regime, because to stay there is better than pulling out, I think, in terms of the welfare of the people.
I think they should cooperate with anyone which allows them to provide aid to people who are suffering on a principled basis. So that's not cooperation. That is simply sort of working to get the job done. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think. But what we should not do is use aid as a pawn for the political work, and that's also been quite a lot of the problems we've had. Certainly I faced it very much when I was told that I wasn't doing my job properly as humanitarian coordinator, as I was unable to solve the problems of refugees, when actually the issue was a political one. Really.
I think the humanitarian organisations are doing a good job, both in providing humanitarian aid, despite the problems I drew attention to, and the fact that they are there is still a deterrent on what the government might do if they were not there, because they are witnesses to what's going on, and governments do not like to be pilloried in the international press, even governments like the regime in Khartoum. Whether the UN peacekeeping force should stay there is another question. It's an expensive item. It's not doing a lot of good, but again, the fact that it's there is probably, on balance, more helpful than not, in simply a deterrent effect on the situation. Might be worse
purely
if
about
the
force in Darfur.
The force in Darfur. Yeah. The force in the South Sudan is a different issue altogether.
So on balance,
can I reply? Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
On that specific issue.
Yes, on this issue, I think it's a fact that aid or humanitarian could prolong conflict or could shorten conflict. This has been to be the case. I'm not belittling the United Nations' contribution to humanitarian aid, as John said, but I think politically the United Nations has failed to solve this problem in order to discontinue this and let people live. I think that it's a moral and the political issue.
Political failure. Yeah. Anyone here think, sorry, we're really reaching the end of the time. Anyone here with strong views that the UN should just get out of Sudan completely because it's actually done far more harm than good? Does anyone take that line? So gentleman right at the back.
I think there's a lady there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I could try answering that question. But I think originally probably, I think one of the biggest problems with the United Nations, as we've seen across the board, is literally based on the fact that its design was not meant to probe up failing states or fragile states. Yeah. And however much you throw in there, look at Congo, it's been there 2 months after Congo got independence. Up to now, United Nations is still there, and yet is one of the biggest and most expensive humanitarian
organizations. As a result, do you think they should just get out then?
I think they should just get out and let those people solve their problem.
Anyone else? Let's just go around quickly, just get some. Gentleman in the front.
Yeah, I mean, the UN, I've sort of worked with the UN in different parts of the world. I mean, not within their infrastructure, but observing what they did in Haiti and various other countries. The thing is that this mission has failed. And so what it needs, and it could be another UN mission that has a military
dimension,
remit, or it has all sorts, that has teeth,
with a tougher mandate,
resolve something that can work towards a solution. Because clearly this mission has failed.
Yeah.
And there's very varied sides to the UN. The point is, what alternative is there? Is it going to be Western forces militarily getting involved to solve a political problem? It's clear everybody is unanimously admitting that the Khartoum regime is majorly culpable in the problem. You've just come back from Nuba. I'd be very interested to hear what your view was of that, and how has Khartoum betrayed the Nuba people too. As everybody's admitting, the Khartoum regime has a continuous history of abuse, and that's not going to change unless they're forced to.
What can we? Would you have one last speaker from the back, and I think we'll have to wind it up then. Is it?
No. The train.
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Yolette Anyange, and I'm a freelance journalist. I'm from Rwanda.
We can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear? Is it any better?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Maybe stand up. But we
stand up.
So we can see.
Hi. So my name is Yolette Anyange. I'm a journalist, and I'm from Rwanda, and I have spent 1 week in the Ida refugee camp, and I have seen nowhere signs of the UN. And this is also one of the reasons why I support the statement that the UN just has no role and has no say, no action whatsoever.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we have to, at this point, say thank you very much for your very pertinent questions. Thank you very much for a really well-informed and provocative panel. Thanks for being provocative.
I can talk for 2 minutes on the Nuba, just because he's come back. And just a quick.
You could talk to him after the end of the meeting.
Can we? We must go. Yes, I think, in fairness to everybody, I think perhaps, I'm sure Mukesh will be very willing to brief you afterwards. Thank you all for coming, and we signally have failed to provide a clear answer to the question, but I think you've heard an array of interesting views. Thank you for coming.